As twilight descends, let me guide you across the boundless steppes of Mongolia, cradle of history's most expansive land empire that stretched from Pacific shores to Eastern European plains. Beyond mere conquest lies the rich tapestry of the Mongol saga, a testament to cultural fusion, ingenious innovation, and trade networks that bridged East and West long before our modern conception of globalization. Close your eyes and drift to windswept grasslands where destiny awaited Temüjin, a child born clutching a blood clot, an omen of greatness who would rise from desperate poverty to become Genghis Khan, ruler of all beneath the eternal blue sky. Part 1. The Rise of Genghis Khan. From outcast to emperor in the year 1162, amidst the whistling grasses of the steppe, a child entered the world, born to Yasuge, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, and his strong-willed wife, Helen. They named him Temüjin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had vanquished in battle. The Mongolia of Temüjin's birth was no unified nation, but a fractured mosaic of nomadic tribes, shifting alliances, and bitter betrayal. Life on the steppes was mercilessly harsh. Winter winds brought bone-shattering cold, temperatures plummeting to 40 below zero, while summer's scorching droughts could decimate the precious herds upon which all survival hinged. In this brutal landscape, only the most resilient and adaptable could hope to survive. From his earliest days, Temüjin absorbed the essential skills of the steppe warrior, drawing a bow with deadly precision while thundering across the plains and enduring days without food or shelter lessons that would forge his indomitable spirit. Yet even measured against the unforgiving standards of steppe existence, the boy's childhood would prove exceptionally brutal. When just 9 years old, his father took him to the family of his betrothed, Bert, to arrange their marriage, leaving him there to be raised by his future in-laws, a common Mongolian custom. As life ebbed from him, Yasuge sent a trusted companion to retrieve his son and return him to the family. Upon his father's death, the clan members swiftly abandoned Temüjin's family, refusing to follow a mere child. The deepest water dries up, the brightest stone crumbles, they told his mother with cold pragmatism, stripping away even the ancestral herds, the family's only lifeline. The widow and her children were thrust into desperate survival, subsisting on bitter roots, wild berries, and whatever small game they could trap, living as outcasts on the brutal margins of tribal society. When the master dies, the servants scatter like drifting smoke. When the mother tree falls, the saplings cannot stand alone. Yet this period of crushing poverty became the forge that tempered Temüjin's character. Alongside his mother and siblings, he learned the raw skills of survival, hunting elusive marmots, fishing in icy streams, crafting crude garments from the tiny skins of field mice sewn together with sinew, and discovering the unbreakable strength of family loyalty when all external support had vanished like morning mist. His indomitable mother, a wellspring of wisdom and fortitude, instilled in her children the vital truth that their only hope lay in absolute unity. Together, you can withstand any enemy, she counseled, but a single arrow is easily broken. Yet tragedy continued to shadow the young boy's path. Around the age of 12, in a moment that would foreshadow his ruthless pragmatism, this bloody act established his dominance within the family circle, but burdened him with the grave consequences of fraternal blood shed among the most heinous crimes in Mongol society. Shortly after this fateful incident, disaster struck again with merciless force. Warriors from the Temüjin clan, once loyal followers of his father, But fate had not finished writing his story. One night, noticing his guards distracted during raucous celebration, the captive seized his chance, smashing his wooden collar against a rock and vanishing into the velvet darkness. During his desperate flight, a Temüjin pursuer spotted him hiding in the shallow waters of a river, but, in a moment of inexplicable mercy, chose to keep silent about his discovery. This mysterious act of compassion would be etched forever in Temüjin's memory, and years later, when power was his, he richly rewarded this Mansorkan Shirafor, that single moment of humanity. Even in these darkest hours, the future conqueror was learning the indelible lessons of which acts of kindness and cruelty would later shape his own approach to leadership. After his daring escape from captivity, Temüjin reunited with his family and soon sought out his betrothed, Bert. Their marriage proved strategically brilliant, forging a critical alliance with her tribe, the Conquerate, and giving the young outcast his first true political connection, the earliest seedling of what would become a vast power base. As a wedding gift, he received a magnificent black sable coat, a treasure of immense value that he would soon leverage with shrewd political instinct. A man without allies was merely awaiting death. Temüjin embarked on a fateful journey to find Togrul, the formidable Khan of the Carrots, and a sworn blood brother to his late father. Presenting the precious sable coat as a gift, masterful diplomatic gesture, the young leader secured Togrul's promise of support, making his legendary declaration, "I will be your right hand." Who had once kidnapped his mother, raided Temüjin's camp and captured his new bride Bert in a calculated act of vengeance. With the crucial backing of the Carrot Khan and the assistance of his childhood friend and future rival, Jamuka, Temüjin launched his first military campaign, successfully rescuing his wife after several agonizing months of captivity in enemy hands. Bert's return brought both joy and complications. She was pregnant, and the child, Joki, would forever carry the shadow of uncertain paternity. Yet, in a decision that revealed his pragmatic vision, Temüjin claimed the boy as his own without hesitation, demonstrating a philosophy about family and loyalty that would later define his empire building. Throughout his remarkable life, competence and unwavering loyalty would consistently matter more to him than bloodlines or background. A revolutionary concept that shattered the rigid hierarchies of traditional tribal society. He demonstrated a remarkable ability to attract followers not through traditional tribal connections, but through a new currency, personal loyalty. Breaking radically with centuries of tradition, he elevated men based purely on merit rather than family ties, offering advancement to anyone who proved their worth, even former enemies who pledged allegiance. This revolutionary meritocracy drew the talented and ambitious to his banner in unprecedented numbers, particularly from less prestigious clans, who recognized in his rising power an opportunity for their own advancement. His expanding sphere of influence eventually strained the relationship with his blood brother and ally Jamuka. The two men embodied competing visions of leadership. Jamuka followed the traditional aristocratic model that had governed steppe life for generations, while Temüjin created something entirely new, a system based on personal loyalty and demonstrated merit rather than hereditary privilege. When their paths inevitably diverged around 1182, their respective followers were forced to choose sides, igniting a protracted struggle for supremacy that would reshape the steppe world. This conflict would rage for nearly 2 decades, marked by fierce battles, calculated betrayals, and constantly shifting alliances that gradually consolidated the fragmented Mongol tribes under Temüjin's increasingly powerful banner. The stakes became unmistakably clear in 1186 when Jamuka's supporters proclaimed their leader, Gurkhan, universal ruler, an act that threw down the gauntlet. Only one man could ultimately rule the Mongol tribes, and the battle lines were drawn. Throughout this period of constant warfare, Temüjin displayed the strategic brilliance that would later reshape continents. After suffering a significant defeat at the Battle of 13 Sides, he demonstrated the wisdom to retreat and regroup rather than making a desperate last stand that would have ended his ambitions forever. With methodical patience, he systematically formed alliances with his opponent's enemies, including the powerful Carats under their Khan, his father's old ally. When these relationships became strained, as they did with Togrul around 1203, Temüjin revealed his ruthless pragmatism, unhesitatingly eliminating former supporters who had become obstacles to his greater vision, the complete unification of all Mongol and Turkic tribes across the vast steppes. At a momentous assembly known as a Kurultai, held in the shadow of the sacred mountain Berkenkalden, the assembled tribal leaders performed the ancient ritual of raising him on a felt carpet and proclaimed him. Now, as Genghis Khan, he stood unchallenged atop the largest confederation of nomadic peoples history had ever witnessed. When his former blood brother Jamuka was finally brought before him in chains, after years of bitter rivalry, the Khan offered reconciliation. Jamuka refused, requesting instead a noble death without the spilling of blood, a final act of defiance and dignity. With solemn respect, the new Khan ordered his execution by having his back broken, a death befitting royalty, and commanded that his remains be buried with full honors, last tribute to the man who had been both his greatest friend and most formidable adversary. At the momentous Kurultai, Genghis Khan immediately began transforming his hard-won tribal coalition into something unprecedented, a disciplined empire. He instituted the Yasa, a comprehensive legal code that imposed standardized laws across all tribes. He revolutionized military organization with a decimal system of units 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, Tumon, that shattered traditional tribal groupings in favor of ruthless efficiency. With visionary foresight, he established a primitive but effective bureaucracy and created an elite corps of messengers, row-bearers, who could transmit his commands with astonishing speed across the vast territories now under his dominion. Perhaps his most radical innovation was the complete dismantling of the old tribal aristocracy. In its place rose a new elite built entirely on loyalty and service to him. The sons of vanquished chiefs faced execution or banishment, while those who had proven their allegiance, regardless of their humble origins, were elevated to positions of power. His personal guard unit, the Keshik, would become the crucible from which his most brilliant generals and administrators would emerge. At 44 years old, having risen from the depths of abandonment to imperial glory, Genghis Khan gazed beyond the horizons of his newly unified realm. Standing before the assembled tribal leaders at the Kurultai, his voice carried across the windswept steppe as he declared, "I have risen from the brown earth to the throne of gold. I intend to bring the entire world under my hoofbeats." Around him, battle-hardened warriors, veterans of decades of brutal intertribal warfare, lifted their eyes to the civilizations that had long looked down upon them. The wealthy but fragmented Middle Kingdom of China to the south, the opulent Muslim empires to the west, and beyond them, the distant kingdoms of Europe that had yet to hear the thunder of Mongol hooves. With a people forged into absolute unity and a war machine honed to lethal perfection through years of conflict, the Khan prepared to unleash a storm of conquest unparalleled in human history. The nomad had transformed into an emperor, and the settled world remained blissfully ignorant of the cataclysm gathering strength beyond their borders. As Genghis Khan's gaze swept across the vast steppes toward distant lands, the great empires of Eurasia had no conception of the tempest about to break upon them, tempest that would rewrite the very course of human history. Thus ended the first chapter in the epic saga of Genghis Khan, from abandoned outcast to supreme ruler of the steppes. But as the stars glimmered in the endless Mongolian sky, they whispered of greater conquests yet to come. The world beyond the grasslands would soon tremble at his name, as the greatest land empire in history began to unfold beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. Part 2. How the Mongol war machine crushed entire kingdoms as the dust settled on the momentous Kurultai of 1206. Genghis Khan stood poised at history's precipice. The unification of the Mongol tribes was not an endpoint, but the spark of something far greater. With the vast steppes now united under his singular command, the newly proclaimed Khan cast his calculating gaze toward the sedentary civilizations that had for centuries regarded the nomadic peoples as mere savages beyond their walls. These kingdoms remained blissfully unaware that from the fierce crucible of tribal warfare had emerged what would become the most devastating military force the medieval world would ever face. The army Genghis Khan unleashed was no ordinary collection of warriors. It was nothing less than a revolutionary military system engineered for conquest on a scale never before witnessed. Every element of this formidable force represented the perfect fusion of ancient steppe traditions, refined to deadly precision, and bold innovations that would forever transform the art of warfare. At the beating heart of the steppe military stood the horse archer, arguably the most formidable warrior of the pre-modern era. These fighters were truly born to the saddle, learning to ride before they could walk, and beginning their training with the bow almost from infancy. By adulthood, a Mongol warrior could strike targets with uncanny accuracy while galloping at full speed, unleash a storm of arrows in mere seconds, and maneuver with a fluid grace that left infantry-centered armies utterly confounded. The composite bow in their hands was nothing short of a technological wonder, an intricate laminated construction of wood, horn, and sinew that could outrange virtually any contemporary weapon. With a punishing draw, weight exceeding 160 pounds, and an effective range beyond 300 yards, these archers could rain death upon enemy formations long before those enemies could even hope to respond. Each warrior carried multiple bows and an arsenal of up to 300 arrows, including specialized armor-piercing projectiles designed specifically to penetrate the heaviest defenses of their foes. Genghis Khan organized this lethal host through an innovative decimal system that deliberately shattered traditional tribal bonds. Warriors were meticulously grouped in units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 tumen. This revolutionary organization enabled precise command and control across vast distances and complex battlefields. Most crucially, it established a true meritocracy where leadership positions were earned through demonstrated skill and unwavering loyalty rather than birthright. A radical concept that allowed the most brilliant fighters to ascend through the ranks regardless of their humble origins. Within this army, discipline was absolute and unforgiving. The penalty for desertion, abandoning a fallen comrade, or failing to properly share plunder, was swift death. Yet this iron discipline was counterbalanced by extraordinarily generous rewards. Mongol warriors received far greater shares of conquered wealth than soldiers in virtually any contemporary army, fostering a fierce loyalty and motivation that bordered on fanatical. As one Persian chronicler observed with a mixture of awe and terror, "Each man is worth more than 10 of their enemies, for they all profit when they win, and all die when they lose." While the tactical brilliance of the steppe army was unmatched on the battlefield, Genghis Khan understood that wars were won as much in the minds of enemies as on blood-soaked fields. He elevated psychological warfare into a terrifying art form, wielding terror as a strategic weapon with cold, calculating precision. Before launching assaults against major kingdoms, his forces methodically annihilated smaller settlements that dared resist, while deliberately sparing those that surrendered immediately. Survivors were often incorporated into his growing army as auxiliaries, or deliberately sent ahead to spread harrowing tales of utter devastation, creating a paralyzing wave of fear that raced ahead of the main force. As horrific accounts spread of entire cities being erased and populations massacred without mercy, many subsequent targets chose immediate surrender over futile resistance. The Mongols cultivated this fearsome reputation through calculated public displays of brutality designed to maximize psychological impact. After capturing the Tangut city of Wuhai in 1209, they executed the defending general by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. A ghastly spectacle orchestrated not merely as punishment but as a chilling message that would travel faster than any army ever could. Yet this campaign of terror was applied with strategic restraint and purpose. Cities that surrendered without resistance were generally spared destruction, their skilled artisans and craftsmen conscripted rather than slaughtered, their existing governance structures often preserved intact under Mongol oversight. This created a powerful incentive for prompt submission rather than desperate resistance, allowing Genghis Khan's forces to absorb vast territories without having to fight costly battles for every settlement. As one advisor reportedly counseled Genghis Khan in words that would echo through centuries, "The greatest joy a man can know is to conquer his enemies and drive them before him, to ride their horses and take away their possessions, to see the faces of those who were dear to them bedewed with tears, and to clasp their wives and daughters in his arms." What truly distinguished the Mongol military from all contemporaries was its unparalleled operational mobility and tactical flexibility. While other medieval armies typically plodded along at a mere 10 to 12 miles per day, these mounted warriors could cover an astonishing 60 to 100 miles when necessary. Each fighter maintained a string of 3 to 5 horses, switching mounts regularly to prevent exhaustion. Unencumbered by slow-moving supply trains, the Khan's armies could materialize seemingly from nowhere, striking with devastating force before defenders could even begin to prepare. Rather than relying on rigid formations, these nomadic warriors perfected the art of fluid battlefield tactics. Their signature maneuver was the feigned retreat, deadly deception that drew enemy forces into a disorganized pursuit before suddenly turning to envelop and annihilate them. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, Russian forces pursued what they mistakenly believed was a beaten Mongol detachment for 9 grueling days, becoming dangerously strung out and vulnerable before the steppe fighters suddenly wheeled around and utterly destroyed them. Genghis Khan's generals were undisputed masters of the envelopment, executing perfectly coordinated movements to surround enemy forces from multiple directions. At the pivotal Battle of Yehuling in 1211 against the mighty Jin dynasty, his forces split into 3 divisions, attacked from completely unexpected directions, and trapped the numerically superior Jin army in a devastating encirclement from which there was no escape. Unlike many contemporary powers wedded to tradition, these nomadic conquerors demonstrated remarkable adaptability when facing unfamiliar challenges. When confronting the formidable walled cities of Shina obstacles, the steppe warriors had little previous experience with. They rapidly absorbed and improved upon Chinese siege expertise. They recruited engineers from conquered territories, swiftly mastered the construction and operation of catapults, trebuchets, and other complex siege engines, and developed innovative tactics such as diverting rivers to undermine seemingly impregnable city walls. This extraordinary adaptability eventually extended even to naval warfare, despite originating from a landlocked steppe environment with no maritime tradition whatsoever. The forces under Genghis Khan's successors would eventually construct entire fleets to launch ambitious attacks on Japan and Java. Though these naval campaigns achieved less spectacular success than their legendary land conquests. As night deepens, imagine the Western Shaya, sophisticated Buddhist kingdom controlling vital trade routes between China and Central Asia, becoming the first settled civilization to face Genghis Khan's newly unified war machine. In 1205, just before the Kurultai that would proclaim him Genghis Khan, Temüjin began testing the kingdom's defenses with calculated raids into Tangut territory. By 1207, the pattern that would become his terrible signature emerged as full invasion commenced. When the proud Tanguts rejected his demands for submission, Khan's forces revealed their innovative military genius, diverting rivers to undermine seemingly impregnable walls and adapting Chinese siege engines with deadly efficiency. Within 3 years, the Western Shaya ruler knelt in submission, accepting vassal status and providing troops that would help conquer other lands. With this first conquest secured like a jewel in his growing crown, the great Khan turned his piercing gaze toward a far greater prize, the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin campaign began in 1211 with a brilliantly orchestrated 3-pronged invasion that caught the defenders completely unprepared. Despite commanding vastly superior numbers, a standing army exceeding 1 million soldiers, the Jin found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn by the nomadic horsemen. The decisive Battle of Yehuling stands as testament to the steppe warriors' tactical mastery. 100,000 Mongol fighters systematically dismantling a Jin force 5 times their size through elaborate feigned retreats and lightning-fast flanking maneuvers. When the dust settled, 60,000 Jin soldiers lay dead, while the nomadic forces suffered minimal losses. The aftermath brought systematic reduction of Jin cities over the following years. In 1215, their capital Jiangdu fell after a merciless siege that reduced its inhabitants to starvation. What followed would become a grim template for cities that resisted officials and military officers executed without mercy. Thoroughgoing plunder and slaughter, so extensive that refugees spoke of streets slick with human fat. Though the Jin's final defeat would await Genghis Khan's successors, his campaigns had delivered a mortal wound to the once mighty empire. Perhaps most remarkable was the Khan's strategic vision that allowed him to coordinate military operations across multiple distant fronts simultaneously. Even while prosecuting the Jin campaign, he dispatched forces westward under his brilliant general Jib the Arrow to subdue the Karakatay Empire, controlling much of Central Asia. Rather than relying solely on brute force, Jib employed sophisticated political manipulation, forging alliances with discontented vassals and religious minorities. Suffering under Karakatay rule, this masterful combination of military pressure and political intrigue brought about the empire's rapid collapse by 1218, adding vast new territories to the Mongol domain. The strategic implications of conquering Karakatay reached far beyond simple territorial expansion. It extended Genghis Khan's realm to the borders of the powerful Khwarezmian Empire and granted control over the lucrative east-west trade routes that had flowed for centuries. Merchants who once paid tribute to multiple powers now answered to a single authority, foreshadowing the Pax Mongolica that would eventually connect distant corners of Eurasia in unprecedented ways. Underlying these dramatic conquests was perhaps the Mongols' greatest innovation, a logistical system centuries ahead of its time. While contemporary armies moved at the pace of their slowest supply wagons, these steppe warriors lived off the land with remarkable efficiency. Each fighter carried dried meat paste, yogurt, and preserved foods that sustained him for days without resupply. In emergencies, they drew small amounts of blood from their horses, veins carefully making incisions that wouldn't permanently harm their most precious military asset. Felt tents provided shelter in any weather, and their ability to travel with minimal equipment allowed for operational speeds that left enemies utterly confounded. Intelligence gathering formed another cornerstone of the Khan's military genius. Before major campaigns, he dispatched an intricate network of merchants, spies, and diplomatic missions to collect detailed information about potential targets. These reconnaissance efforts mapped terrain, cataloged fortifications, identified political divisions ripe for exploitation, and even studied enemy leaders' personalities to anticipate their reactions. During campaigns, his forces maintained a sophisticated communication system using relays of horses, signal fires, and arrow messengers that transmitted commands across vast distances at unprecedented speeds. This allowed Genghis Khan to coordinate army groups separated by hundreds of miles, bringing them together with timing that repeatedly caught enemies in devastating traps. The military brilliance of these conquests exacted a staggering human toll. Contemporary chroniclers claimed northern China's population declined by tens of millions. Figures modern historians consider exaggerated, but archaeological evidence confirms widespread abandonment of previously populated areas, beyond direct casualties. These invasions triggered cascading ecological and economic collapse as sophisticated agricultural systems failed. Across northern China, once productive farmlands reverted to pasture or forest as peasant populations perished or fled. Similar patterns would later emerge throughout Central Asia and the Middle East, where irrigation systems built over centuries fell into disrepair. Yet behind this devastation lay cold strategic calculation. For Genghis Khan, depopulated regions became grazing lands for the horses that formed the backbone of Mongol military power, effectively converting agricultural land back to the pasture that sustained his people's nomadic lifestyle. As one scholar observed with chilling clarity, in a very real sense, they were not conquering land, but harvesting it. By 1219, a mere 13 years after unifying the disparate tribes, Genghis Khan commanded an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of the Islamic world. The Western Shia had been subjugated, the Jin dynasty was crumbling, and the Karakatay had been absorbed into his expanding realm. Yet, the most devastating campaigns, the ones that would truly shake civilization to its foundations, still awaited. As the great Khan gathered his forces along the border of the Khwarezmian Empire, he sent a message to Shah Muhammad, revealing both his supreme confidence and worldview. I am the master of the lands of the rising sun, while you rule those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace. The Shah's fateful response would soon unleash one of history's most catastrophic military campaigns, as the steppe war machine prepared to descend upon the Islamic world with unprecedented fury. The nomads, once dismissed as mere barbarians by their civilized neighbors, had proven themselves masters of warfare on a scale that would reshape continents. As you drift toward sleep, contemplate how this military revolution built upon horseback archery, psychological warfare, and brilliant leadership would continue transforming the world in ways that echo through history to our present day. Part 3. The invasion of Persia, the destruction of the Khwarezm Empire as twilight fell on the year 1218. Genghis Khan stood at the pinnacle of his power in the east, with northern China and Central Asia now beneath his boot. His penetrating gaze turned westward toward a glittering prize, the magnificent Khwarezm Empire. This Muslim realm, spanning modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and vast swaths of Central Asia, shimmered like a jewel in the desert sun, ruled by the ambitious Shah Muhammad II. Khwarezm was a civilization in full bloom, its coffers overflowing with Silk Road riches, its borders patrolled by armies hundreds of thousands strong, its skyline punctuated by minarets and domes that housed treasuries of Islamic knowledge and art. What followed would become one of history's most fateful collisions, a thunderous meeting between the nomadic war machine of the steppes and a sophisticated Islamic empire that would forever alter the Middle East's destiny. Unlike his previous campaigns driven by territorial hunger, this cataclysmic conflict ignited from a diplomatic spark that would escalate into history's most devastating vendetta. In a gesture of peaceful commerce, Genghis Khan dispatched 450 merchants to Khwarezm, bearing exotic goods and a message that resonated with both confidence and restraint. I am master of the lands of the rising sun, and you rule those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace. The Shah's initial response seemed measured, gifts exchanged, diplomatic courtesies observed. When Genghis sent a follow-up embassy, led by Muslim ambassadors, to strengthen these peaceful overtures, the delicate balance shattered. At the frontier city of Otrar, the governor known as Inaluk or Gayer, Khan accused the merchant caravan of espionage, confiscated their valuable cargo, and ordered their execution to the last man. When the subsequent diplomatic mission arrived seeking answers, Shah Muhammad made a fatal miscalculation. He ordered all but one ambassador executed, their beards burned away in unforgivable desecration in Mongol culture. To the steppe warriors, ambassadors were protected by divine law. Their murder wasn't merely an insult, but a transgression against heaven's mandate itself. Learning of this sacrilege, Genghis Khan reportedly ascended a mountain alone, spending 3 days in communion with the eternal blue sky before descending with terrible resolve. Persian chroniclers recorded his chilling proclamation. The sovereignty of the urban people of these territories I will give to the youngest of my sons, but first I must reduce them to such a state that the foals of my horses might frolic in their palaces. The Mongol response was calculated not in hot rage, but in cold, meticulous preparation. Throughout 1219, Genghis Khan assembled perhaps the largest nomadic army ever mustered, approximately 200,000 warriors, drawn from every corner of his expanding realm. The great Khan himself, though advancing in years, assumed personal command, bringing his sons Joki, Chagatai, Gadai, and Tolui to witness and learn the art of empire breaking. Against this approaching storm, Shah Muhammad could theoretically field superior numbers, perhaps 400,000 warriors, but instead of concentrating this formidable force for decisive engagement, he committed a catastrophic strategic blunder. Paralyzed by the Mongols' fearsome reputation for lightning warfare, he scattered his armies among garrison cities across his vast territories, unwittingly offering his empire to be devoured piece by piece. The invasion erupted in early 1220, with Mongol columns striking simultaneously across multiple fronts to overwhelm the Shah's fractured defenses. Otrar, the city where the initial offense occurred, endured a 5-month siege before falling. True to his reputation for poetic justice, Genghis Khan devised a special fate for Inalhuk, the governor responsible for the merchant massacre. The man met his end as molten silver cascaded into his eyes and ears, a punishment that mirrored his greed in both symbolism and agony. But Otrar was merely the overture to a symphony of destruction. The legendary cities of Transoxiana, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench lay in the invader's path, each a luminous center of Islamic scholarship and culture, each encircled by imposing walls and defended by thousands. The fate awaiting these metropolises would reveal the terrifying efficiency of Mongol warfare in its fullest expression. Bukhara, one of Islam's most venerated intellectual centers, was the first great city to face the Mongol hurricane. Its outer defenses collapsed with alarming speed in March 1220. When the garrison attempted a desperate breakout, Mongol light cavalry hunted them across the countryside like wolves pursuing scattered sheep. After the city surrendered, Genghis Khan rode his horse directly into the Grand Mosque, proclaimed himself the flail of God, and commanded the city's elites to surrender their hidden treasures. After methodically stripping Bukhara of its wealth, the Mongols introduced a tactic of psychological warfare they would employ throughout the campaign, forcing the city's population to serve as human shields for the assault on their next target, Samarkand, the sight of neighbors and countrymen driven before the Mongol vanguard, compelled to fill moats with their bodies or march into arrow storms ahead of Mongol troops, shattered the will of each subsequent city. Samarkand, with its massive fortifications and garrison of 100,000 defenders, had been considered impregnably. It crumbled within days. When the city's Turkish mercenaries attempted to negotiate separate surrender terms, Genghis Khan ordered them all executed, reinforcing his brutal message that neither resistance nor betrayal offered salvation. The city's artisans, some 30,000 skilled craftsmen, were identified and forcibly relocated to Mongolia to serve the empire's growing needs, while countless other inhabitants met death beneath Mongol swords. As his great cities toppled one after another, Shah Muhammad chose flight over confrontation, a decision that dissolved whatever remained of his army's morale and his people's hope. Pursued relentlessly by an elite Mongol detachment commanded by generals Jeb and Subutai, the once mighty ruler found himself cornered on a tiny island in the Caspian Sea, where he perished in isolation and despair in early 1221, a fallen king, with no kingdom left to rule. The Shah's death did nothing to slow the Mongol tide. If anything, the campaign grew more systematic and devastating in its execution. Urgench, the Khwarezmian capital, defied expectations by offering fierce resistance, its defenders contesting the invaders street by street. Enraged by this unexpected defiance, the Mongols engineered a devastating solution, diverting the mighty Amu Darya River to flood the besieged city. When Urgench finally surrendered after 6 brutal months, the retribution was apocalyptic. Contemporary accounts, though likely embellished, claim each Mongol warrior was personally tasked with executing 24 civilians. While such precise figures may be exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms a demographic catastrophe of staggering proportions. The celebrated cultural beacons of Eastern Persia suffered equally merciless fates. Merv, Nishapur, and Herotsides, whose libraries, observatories, and universities had illuminated the Islamic world for centuries, were methodically erased in 1221. At Merv, the population was ordered to evacuate in orderly fashion, only to be systematically slaughtered in groups beyond the city walls. Modern scholarship suggests hundreds of thousands perished in this single atrocity. After Nishapur revolted and killed a Mongol general who was Genghis Khan's son-in-law, the retribution transcended even the usual boundaries of Mongol vengeance. The entire city was razed so thoroughly that survivors reported separate mounds made of men, women, and children. In their comprehensive fury, the Mongols slaughtered even household pets, ensuring nothing lived to remember the city that once stood. The devastation inflicted upon the Khwarezm Empire exceeded anything in medieval memory, even by the harsh standards of an age accustomed to warfare's cruelties. Historians estimate the population of Persian lands may have plummeted by as much as 75% in regions directly touched by the Mongol scourge. Ingenious irrigation systems that had transformed desert into gardens for centuries were systematically destroyed, converting once fertile farmlands back to wasteland. Cities that had stood as intellectual beacons for half a millennium were either abandoned entirely or diminished to hollow shells of their former glory. Persian chroniclers captured this apocalypse in prose, as stark as the devastation itself. One wrote with devastating simplicity, "They came, they destroyed, they burned, they killed, they plundered, they departed." Another, grappling with the scale of the calamity, observed, "If in 1,000 years from now the world should bring forth a monster, it will still be less monstrous than Genghis Khan." So profound was the trauma that Persian historians simply termed it the disaster and interpreted it as divine punishment for the Islamic world's perceived spiritual failings. Amid the ashes of conquest, seeds of a new order were taking root. Cities that bowed without battle, like Balkh, found mercy in surrender. The great Khan, despite his reputation for brutality, displayed unexpected nuance, extending protection to Islamic holy men who approached with dignity and preserving their sacred spaces. His armies, far from being chaotic hordes, operated with surgical precision. Every act of destruction served clear strategic purposes, orchestrated by a commander whose control over his warriors remained absolute. By 1222, as the dust settled over Persia, Genghis Khan made a calculated decision. Instead of immediately installing governors, he withdrew his main forces, leaving the conquered lands to simmer in their devastation. The empire's administrative machinery would follow Latura's deliberate pause that allowed shock and awe to crystallize into acceptance of the new reality before reconstruction began under his successor's watchful eyes. While the main army turned eastward, a remarkable expedition unfolded. 20,000 riders under Generals Jebe and Subataya force other empires would consider an army, yet merely a reconnaissance detachment by Mongol standards embarked on what historians now recognize as one of history's most extraordinary military feats. This lightning force swept through the kingdoms of the Caucasus, crushed a Russian coalition at the Kalka River, and carved a 5,500-mile circular path through Crimea before rejoining the main Forza 3-year campaign that demonstrated how Mongol mobility had effectively shrunk the known world. The Khwarezmian collapse reverberated across continents. Central Asia and Persia lay open to Mongol dominion, creating a power vacuum in the Islamic world that would remain unsettled for generations. Refugees scattered like wind-blown seeds, carrying terrifying tales of the steppe horsemen whose arrows seemed to blot out the sun. Among these fleeing scholars was a young man destined to become Nasir al-Din al-Tuzia, brilliant mind, who would eventually serve the very conquerors he fled. Under Mongol patronage, he would establish the famed Maraga Observatory, a testament to how destruction could paradoxically birth new intellectual flowering, as knowledge and expertise were redistributed across the reforged empire. For Genghis Khan, now in the winter of his life, the Persian campaign represented his masterwork. In his 60s and age, when most men of his era had long since retired from warfare, he had personally commanded armies across thousands of miles of the world's most unforgiving terrain. In less than 2 years, he had toppled what had been one of Islam's mightiest empires, sending an unmistakable message echoing across the known world: submit willingly or be reduced to memory. As his war-hardened forces turned back toward China, where unfinished conquests awaited with both the Jin dynasty and Western Shia, the blueprint of Mongol dominance was now fully realized: a terrible alchemy of overwhelming force, psychological warfare, and pragmatic governance that his descendants would employ for generations. The Khwarezm campaign revealed the essence of Genghis Khan's imperial vision. Unlike conquerors' content merely to rule existing structures and extract wealth, the Mongols fundamentally rewrote the societies they conquered. Ancient power hierarchies crumbled, populations shifted like pieces on a game board, and landscapes themselves were transformed farmland, returning to pasture as the nomadic worldview reshaped reality itself. This revolutionary approach to empire-building conquest as complete transformation rather than mere occupation explains both the devastating initial impact of Mongol invasions and their ultimately transformative effect on Eurasian civilization. The survivors who rebuilt their worlds did so within an entirely new framework, where the dynamics of power, commerce, and cultural exchange had been fundamentally altered by the passage of the horse lords. As sleep begins to embrace you, envision the aftermath of this mighty tempest that swept across Persia. The broken cities slowly stir back to life like wounded creatures healing. Caravans once again trace their ancient paths along the Silk Road, now secured under Mongol protection. As commerce tentatively resumes, while visible wounds gradually mend, the psychological scars of the conquest would echo through Persian poetry, artwork, and historical consciousness for centuries, a lingering testament to how completely Genghis Khan had fulfilled his terrible oath of vengeance. Yet even as Persia struggled to its feet, the shadow of Mongol expansion was already stretching westward across the Russian principalities into Eastern Europe toward the heart of medieval Christendom. The next collision between the steppe empire and the settled world would unfold on the plains of Russia and Hungary. As Genghis Khan's heirs carried forward his vision of world domination into the European continent, though Genghis Khan himself would never lead campaigns into Europe. He had laid the foundation for this westward thrust during his lifetime. The reconnaissance mission of Generals Jebe and Subutai had returned with precious intelligence about lands beyond the western horizon, knowledge that would prove invaluable as the next generation of Mongol leaders set their sights on conquering the kingdoms of the setting sun. Part 4. The Mongols versus Europe. How they almost conquered the West as your consciousness gently ebbs toward dreamland. Transport yourself to Eastern Europe in 1236, 14 years after Genghis Khan's final breath. Whispers of dread ripple through villages and castles, alike tales of an unstoppable force gathering in the distant east. The empire now answers to Gedai Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen heir, who continues his father's relentless vision of world domination. The European campaign falls to two remarkable commanders, Bato, grandson of Genghis Khan, through his eldest son, Joki, and the legendary general, Subutai. Though now in his 60s, Subutai remains the tactical genius who helped forge the empire from the Pacific to the Caspian. Their army, 130,000 strong, represents not merely numbers but unparalleled quality. These warriors have conquered kingdoms across Asia and the Middle East, their formations honed to mechanical precision, their discipline absolute. Many officers learned warfare directly from Genghis Khan himself, masters of the deadly steppe tactics that had already brought mighty civilizations to their knees. This was no mere raiding party, but a calculated campaign to bring European kingdoms under the shadow of the great Khan's banner. The storm breaks first upon the Volga Bulgars in 1236. This prosperous trading state, controlling crucial river routes, falls swiftly to the invaders. Like water seeking the path of least resistance, the Mongol forces then divide into multiple columns, methodically dismantling the principalities that would one day become Russia. The once mighty Kievan Rus, already fractured by internal rivalries, commits the cardinal error that had doomed so many before them. Rather than uniting against the common threat, each prince faces the eastern tide alone, and alone each prince falls. Russian cities tumble like dominoes. Ryazan crumbles after just 5 days in December 1237, followed by Vladimir Suzdal and countless smaller settlements. Contemporary chroniclers paint a landscape of absolute desolation. No, I remained to weep for the dead as populations vanish slaughtered where they stand or scattered into the frozen forests. Only Novgorod in the north escapes this fate, saved not by arms but by nature itself. The spring thaw transforms the ground to impassable mud, forcing the horsemen to turn aside. This general mud proves one of Europe's few effective defenses, as the invaders carefully time their campaigns around seasonal conditions to ensure firm ground for their all-important cavalry. Kiev, the resplendent jewel of Russian cities, holds out until December 1240 before succumbing to a ferocious siege. The attackers deploy their full arsenal, catapults raining destruction, sappers undermining walls, and psychological warfare breaking spirits before stones break bodies. When resistance finally collapses, the city's destruction is so complete that visitors in subsequent years describe walking among mountains of bleached skulls and bones, where magnificent golden domes once gleamed. The metropolitan of the Orthodox Church flees rather than bow to the new masters of pattern that repeats across Eastern Europe as the old order crumbles. With the Russian principalities reduced to smoking ruins, the inexorable advance pushes westward at a pace that terrifies European observers. By early 1241, the Mongol vanguard stands poised to strike at Central Europe's heart. They execute their signature strategy of coordinated, multi-pronged attacks. Genghis Khan's forces slice through Poland, while Subutais' army targets Hungary. The timing is immaculate both. Armies aim to converge on the Hungarian plain, terrain eerily similar to their steppe homeland and perfect for their style of mounted warfare. Europe stands woefully unprepared for what comes. Unlike China or the Islamic world, which had centuries of experience with nomadic armies, European kingdoms have never faced warriors of such sophistication. The heavy cavalry of medieval Christendom knights, trained for powerful but straightforward shock charges, lack the mobility and tactical flexibility of steppe horse archers. European foot soldiers, mostly conscripted peasants, have even less hope against the lightning-fast horsemen, whose arrows seem to blot out the sun itself. On April 9, 1241, near Legnica, a Polish army, reinforced by German Teutonic knights, encounters the northern Mongol force. Duke Henry II of Silesia leads this European coalition of Polish, German, and Moravian troops, formidable army by Western standards. Yet, like countless commanders before him across Asia, Henry fails to comprehend the battlefield revolution he faces. The Battle of Legnica opens with a disciplined Polish charge that initially pushes back the lighter Mongol cavalry. But this apparent success masks a deadly trap, the feigned retreat that had claimed so many armies before. As the Polish knights eagerly pursue what they believe to be fleeing enemies, their formation stretches and disorders. Behind their lines, the Mongols deploy a weapon never before seen in European warfare: smoke bombs that release thick, disorienting clouds across the battlefield, sowing confusion among the Europeans. When the Mongol forces suddenly wheel around and counterattack, they catch the Polish knights perfectly positioned for their devastating composite bows. Though European plate armor offers some protection, the Mongol archers target the knights' horses with surgical precision, dismounting these elite warriors and rendering them virtually helpless. Once the knights lie scattered and immobilized, Mongol lancers and saber-wielding cavalry close in for the final slaughter. The defeat is absolute. Duke Henry falls in battle, his severed head displayed on a spear before Legnica's walls as a grim warning. The victors reportedly collect 9 enormous sacks filled with ears harvested from fallen European warriors, macabre accounting system used to tally their kills and report successes to their commanders. Barely 2 days after this catastrophe, Subutais' main force confronts the Hungarian army of King IV near the river at Mohi. Hungary stands as one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, and has assembled perhaps Bashar Zero-Men, the largest European army yet to face the eastern threat. Subutai, displaying the tactical brilliance that made him Genghis Khan's most valued general, sets an ingenious trap. Under night's cover, his engineers quietly construct a pontoon bridge across the river, while launching a noisy diversionary attack at the main bridge. When Hungarian forces concentrate to defend the obvious crossing point, Mongol warriors pour across the hidden bridge, outflanking the European army in a masterful demonstration of battlefield deception. The Hungarians had crafted what they believed to be an impregnable sanctuary, a circular fortress of wagons where their forces could weather the storm. Instead, this would become their tomb. Mongol archers encircled this makeshift haven, transforming it into a killing field as arrows rained down like deadly hail upon the tightly packed defenders. When desperation finally drove the Hungarians to break free, they rushed toward what appeared to be a providential gap in the western encirclement, only to discover Subuti's masterful deception. Hidden heavy cavalry waited in ambush, springing the trap that would complete the slaughter. Mohi stands as perhaps the most devastating military catastrophe in European history. The blood-soaked plain claimed an estimated 70,000 Hungarian lives, effectively shattering the kingdom's military might in a single, terrible day. King Fornau, a monarch without an army, fled for his life, seeking refuge in a distant Adriatic fortress, while Mongol pursuit units tracked him relentlessly across his crumbling realm. In the wake of these twin military calamities, the conquerors methodically consolidated their hold on Hungary while launching lightning raids into Austria, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Contemporary chroniclers, their parchments stained with tears of despair, captured Europe's terror in apocalyptic imagery. They came swarming like locusts over the face of the earth, bringing terrible devastation to the eastern parts, laying waste with fire and carnage. By the winter of 1241, Mongol vanguards had reached Vienna's gates and stood upon the Adriatic shores. Scout parties appeared like phantoms along the Holy Roman Empire's eastern frontier, materializing near Vienna, Wiener, Neustadt, and Klosterneuburg. Europe trembled on the precipice of the same fate that had befallen mighty civilizations across Asia, and then in what must be counted among history's most pivotal twists of fate, the seemingly unstoppable tide suddenly receded. On December 11th, 1241, thousands of miles away in Mongolia, Grand Khan Gadai drew his final breath. This distant death reverberated across the empire, compelling princes and generals to return to their ancestral homeland for the Kurultai, the sacred assembly that would determine succession. By spring 1242, Batu Khan issued the unexpected command for his forces to withdraw from Central Europe, retreating back to the Russian steppes. This remarkable withdrawal has puzzled historians for centuries, while Gadai's death and the ensuing succession crisis undoubtedly played a crucial role. Some scholars point to environmental factors as equally significant. The Hungarian plain, despite its superficial resemblance to the steppes, may have failed to provide sufficient grazing for the massive horse herds that constituted the army's living engine. Each warrior required up to 5 mounts for effective campaigning year. Logistical challenge that even the brilliant Mongol military machine could not overcome indefinitely in unfamiliar terrain. Other historians contend that the invaders had already accomplished their strategic objectives by systematically dismantling Eastern Europe's military capacity and demonstrating their overwhelming power. Whatever confluence of factors prompted this retreat, the result was an unexpected reprieve that may have altered the course of Western civilization. Never again would the horsemen of the East penetrate so deeply into Central Europe with comparable force. Though the specter of their return would haunt European politics for generations to come, the European campaigns cast long shadows eastward as well. The Russian principalities would remain under what chroniclers called the Mongol Yuk, the dominion of the Golden Horde, for more than 2 centuries. This prolonged period of foreign suzerainty profoundly shaped Russian political evolution. fostering the centralization of authority in Moscow and nurturing the autocratic governance traditions that would distinguish Russia from Western European political development. Hungary emerged from the cataclysm, fundamentally diminished. Before 1241, the Hungarian kingdom had ranked among Europe's most formidable and populous states. In the invasion's aftermath, its population plummeted by as much as a quarter, with entire regions transformed into depopulated wastelands. Archaeological excavations reveal abandoned villages and mass graves, silent testimonies to the catastrophe that befell the land. This demographic collapse created a power vacuum in Central Europe that would eventually be filled by the ascendant Habsburg dynasty. For Western Europe, the invasion served as a distant yet terrifying harbinger of potential doom. Pope Gregory IX and later Pope Innocent IV attempted to organize unified resistance, even dispatching emissaries to the Mongol court to negotiate peace or perhaps convert the conquerors to Christianity. While these diplomatic missions failed in their immediate objectives, they established the first meaningful contact between Western Europe and the distant reaches of Asia, yielding valuable intelligence about the mysterious lands beyond the steppe frontier. Perhaps the most profound, yet often overlooked consequence of Europe's brush with Eastern conquest was biological. The armies traversing the breadth of Eurasia functioned as unwitting vectors for disease exchange across previously isolated populations. Some historians now believe that the catastrophic Black Death Witch would later claim as much as half of Europe's population in the conquered territories and traveled along the commercial arteries the Mongols had secured and expanded, like a slumbering giant refusing to fade away. The mighty conquerors maintained their formidable presence in Eastern Europe, despite their tactical withdrawal from Central European territories. Under the shrewd leadership of Batu Khan and his successors, the Golden Horde carved out its magnificent capital at Sarai along the lower Volga River. From this glittering nerve center, they commanded an empire spanning the vast landscapes of modern Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the rugged Caucasus. Throughout the 13th and early 14th centuries, their lightning-fast horsemen continued to thunder across borders into Poland, Lithuania, and the Balkans, delivering swift and terrible reminders of their power through calculated punitive raids. In the generations that followed, European military leaders painfully reassessed their approach to warfare, gradually developing more adaptable fighting methods and incorporating ranged combat units. The brilliant military innovations of visionaries like Matthias Corvinus of Hungary emerged directly from the harsh lessons written in blood during confrontations with the superior mobile warfare of the steppe cavalrymen. Perhaps the most profound consequence of all was how these invasions shattered medieval Europe's self-imposed isolation. The Pax Mongolica, the great peace that followed the tempest of conquest, a previously unimaginable doorways to the distant wonders of Asia. European merchants, diplomats, and adventurers suddenly found themselves able to journey across continents with unprecedented safety. Marco Polo's legendary expedition to the splendid court of Kublai Khan would have remained an impossible dream without the remarkable stability and interconnectedness that Mongol rule brought to the vast Eurasian landmass. As you sink deeper into slumber, envision the wave of indescribable relief washing over Europe as word spread of the Eastern Army's withdrawal in 1242. Church bells that had fallen silent in dread now pealed triumphantly across villages and cities. Desperate prayers for salvation transformed into tearful expressions of gratitude. For one breathtaking moment, The people of Central Europe had witnessed what countless Asian civilizations had already endured: the unstoppable fury of the steppe war machine and the profound transformation that inevitably followed in its earth-shaking wake. Yet, even as Europe breathed its collective sigh of relief, the mighty empire was entering its most magnificent era of expansion and unprecedented prosperity. Following Genghis Khan's death and the subsequent elevation of Genghis Khan as his successor, the empire continued its remarkable growth under Genghis Khan's talented descendants. The terrible scars of conquest gradually healed, giving way to the extraordinary phenomenon historians would call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which would establish the most extensive zone of free trade and vibrant cultural exchange the pre-modern world had ever witnessed. As the 13th century reached its midpoint, the vast Mongol dominion stretched across nearly all of Asia and into Eastern Europe. Trade routes that had once been perilous became highways of commerce and cultural exchange. From cosmopolitan cities like Karakorum and Sarai, imperial decrees ensured the safety of merchants and travelers across distances that earlier generations could scarcely comprehend. The shadow of conquest had given way to a golden age of interconnectedness that would reshape the fate of civilizations. Let these final images of a world transformed carry you into peaceful dreams. The story of Genghis Khan and his descendants, a tale of unparalleled conquest, devastation, and ultimately connection, fades gently from your consciousness as sleep embraces you. The distant thunder of hooves across the endless steppes grows softer, the whispers of history more faint, until all that remains is the quiet rhythm of your own breathing in the darkness. Part 5. The Mongol Empire at its peak, the golden age of trade and power, as dawn broke over the 13th century. The vast Mongol Empire, stretching from the misty shores of Korea to the rolling plains of Eastern Europe, entered its golden age. This remarkable era of stability, prosperity, and unprecedented cultural exchange would come to be known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. The thunderous storm of conquest that had redrawn the map of the known world gradually yielded to an age of relative tranquility under Genghis Khan's successors. Following Genghis Khan's death in 1241, the empire briefly trembled with uncertainty. After a shrewd regency under Gedai's widow, Temüjin, the Kurultai of 1246, that sacred assembly of nobles levated Genghis Khan, Gedai's son, to the position of third great Khan. His rule proved fleeting, lasting merely 2 years before his death in 1248 triggered another succession struggle that ultimately crowned Genghis Khan, grandson of Genghis, through his son Tolui in 1251. Under Mongik's masterful leadership, the empire reached its breathtaking territorial zenith. Military campaigns continued to roll like waves across multiple frontiers. His brother Hulagu led armies southward into the Middle East, capturing Baghdad in 1258 and toppling the centuries-old Abbasid Caliphate, while another brother, Kublai, pressed relentlessly into the lush lands of southern China. Yet, increasingly, the imperial focus shifted from raw conquest to something more profound: the consolidation and administration of the vast territories already within the empire's embrace. What blossomed during this remarkable period was nothing less than the most extensive system of free trade and cultural exchange the medieval world had ever witnessed. For the first time in human history, a merchant could journey from the misty shores of the Yellow Sea to the windswept steppes of Hungary under the protection of a single imperial authority. The legendary Silk Road, which had functioned sporadically for centuries, now hummed with unprecedented activity, efficiency, and security. Caravanserais, those desert oases for weary travelers, sprouted at carefully planned intervals along major trade routes, offering food, shelter, fresh mounts, and the precious gift of safety to merchants from distant lands. This sprawling commercial web rested upon an ingenious infrastructure designed to conquer the tyranny of distance. Imperial authorities established the revolutionary Yam Sistema network of post stations positioned approximately a day's ride apart throughout the realm. Each station maintained fresh horses, vital supplies, and comfortable accommodations for official messengers and authorized travelers. Armed with a special Pesa tablet of authority bearing the Consila messenger, could commandeer horses and provisions at any station, covering astonishing distances of up to 250 miles per day when urgency demanded haste. This communication network bound together territories separated by vast mountain ranges, scorching deserts, and endless plains, enabling the lightning-fast transmission of information, commands, and intelligence across the breadth of Eurasia. The stability of this remarkable system depended upon the ruthless suppression of banditry and local warfare within imperial lands. Merchants who had once risked death at every political boundary now traveled beneath the protective shadow of Mongol law. Contemporary chronicles tell us that a maiden bearing a nugget of gold upon her head could wander safely throughout the realm, while certainly embellished. This vivid image captures the unprecedented security established across vast stretches that had previously ranked among the most perilous trade routes on Earth. Taxation transformed from the chaotic plunder of the conquest era to a structured, predictable system. Imperial census takers meticulously counted households, livestock, and agricultural yields to establish fair and regular tax obligations, though these levies often weighed heavily on subject populations. Their predictability allowed commerce and agriculture to heal from the wounds of invasion. Throughout many regions, the Khans granted tax exemptions to religious institutions and skilled artisans, nurturing the revival of cultural and economic vitality across their domains. Perhaps most extraordinary of all, the empire practiced a level of religious tolerance that stood in stark contrast to the dogmatic age in which it existed. While the ruling elite initially adhered to traditional shamanic beliefs of the steppes, they adopted a pragmatic approach to the diverse faiths of their conquered subjects. Genghis Khan himself had proclaimed, "I do not distinguish the merit of one religion above another. I enforce respect for all religions and favor no one in particular." This enlightened policy continued under his descendants, who exempted clergy of all faiths, Buddhist monks in their saffron robes, Muslim imams, Christian priests, and others from taxation and military service. This remarkable religious tolerance fostered intellectual exchange across boundaries that had previously seemed impenetrable. In the great urban centers, under imperial rule, Karakoram, Samarkand, Tabriz, Beijing, scholars and religious leaders from across the known world encountered one another, often for the first time in history. Debate and dialogue between these diverse traditions flourished, particularly at the imperial courts, where curious khans would arrange formal discussions between representatives of different faiths, seeking wisdom from all sources. The administrative architecture of the empire at its zenith represented a fascinating fusion of nomadic traditions with sophisticated bureaucratic systems borrowed from conquered civilizations. At the apex stood the great Khan, whose authority flowed from the mandate of Tengri, the eternal blue sky of steppe tradition. Below him, the empire was divided into four great khanates: the Yuan dynasty governing China under Kublai Khan, the Chagatai Khanate controlling Central Asia, the Ilkhanate ruling Persia, and the Golden Horde dominating Russia and the western steppes. Each khanate maintained significant autonomy while acknowledging the theoretical supremacy of the Great Khan. This flexible arrangement permitted diverse administrative approaches tailored to different regions. In China, the Yuan dynasty adapted much of the pre-existing Confucian bureaucracy, governing through traditional institutions with imperial oversight. In the Islamic world, the Ilkhanate initially ruled through military governors, but gradually incorporated local elites and Islamic administrative practices into their governance. The court at Karakorum, the imperial capital established by Genghis Khan in the Mongolian heartland, became a living microcosm of this multicultural empire. European visitors like William of Rubrek, a Franciscan friar who journeyed there in 1254, stood in awe at the diversity they encountered. Rubrek described a vibrant city where Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and traditional shamans all practiced their faiths openly, where Chinese architects had designed the magnificent imperial palace, and where craftsmen from as far away as France created intricate works for the Khan's pleasure. Within this palace stood perhaps the most captivating example of cross-cultural technological exchange: a magnificent silver fountain designed by Guillaume Boucher, a Parisian goldsmith captured during campaigns in Hungary. This marvel of medieval engineering dispensed fermented mare's milk, rice, wine, mead, and other beverages from silver spouts crafted in the shape of roaring lions, delighting guests at imperial feasts with its ingenuity. More than mere entertainment, it symbolized the empire's unique ability to gather talent from across the world and harness it at the very center of power. The gentle dawn of the Pax Mongolica unleashed an unprecedented wave of knowledge across the continents, like water finding its level. Innovations that had remained landlocked within isolated civilizations now flowed freely along the empire's protected arteries of trade. Paper money, once a Chinese curiosity, became the lifeblood of commerce throughout the realm. Gunpowder, cradled for centuries in Chinese hands, journeyed westward to forever transform the art of war in the Middle East and Europe. Printing presses, celestial instruments, mathematical theorems, and agricultural techniques crossed mountains and deserts that had once been impassable frontiers of human understanding. This grand marriage of East and West rewrote humanity's destiny. Exotic crops bloomed in foreign soils, forever changing the palates of distant peoples. Rhubarb, bright lemons, vibrant carrots, and hardy new wheats journeyed along the safeguarded Silk Roads. The healing wisdom of Persian and Arab physicians found eager students in Chinese medical halls, while ancient Chinese remedies traveled in the opposite direction. Even the very fabric of society transformed as silken patterns from Cathay intertwined with Persian motifs and European techniques, clothing the world's elite in the visual poetry of cross-cultural exchange. At the beating heart of this vast economic body circulated a revolutionary innovation: paper currency, backed by the imperial seal and enforced by imperial might. Though initially met with raised eyebrows by merchants who trusted only the cold weight of metal in their palms, the practical magic of paper for grand transactions eventually won them over. The Khan's justice fell swift and merciless upon counterfeiters, or those who refused this new medium, a stick that complemented the carrot of convenience. Marco Polo, that wide-eyed Venetian wanderer, could scarcely contain his wonder at this financial alchemy that transformed mere mulberry bark into wealth through the mystical power of the Khan's authority. The commercial tendrils of the empire reached far beyond its formal grasp. Caravans bearing the Khan's peace ventured into lands where his name was barely whispered: sub-Saharan Africa, fog-bound Scandinavia, and the verdant isles of Southeast Asia. Shrewd merchants from Venice and Genoa established bustling outposts along the Black Sea, becoming the crucial bridge between East and West, their ledgers recording the first chapters of what would become Europe's economic renaissance. No single life better captures the boundless horizons of this extraordinary age than that of Marco Polo. Setting forth in 1271 with his father and uncle, seasoned traders with salt in their beards the young, Venetian embarked on an odyssey across the spine of Asia to reach Kublai Khan's resplendent court. If we are to believe his account, 17 summers and winters passed while he served the great Khan, witnessing firsthand the splendors and sophistication that lay beyond Europe's limited imagination. Though scholars may quibble over details in his narrative, the very possibility of such a journey and the vivid record it left stands as testament to a world more interconnected than any that had come before. Yet, for all its glories, the Pax Mongolica harbored within it the seeds of its own dissolution. The very pathways that allowed precious goods and knowledge to flow freely became highways for humanity's most merciless enemy, disease. The Black Death, awakening from its slumber in the heartlands of Asia, followed the well-worn routes of commerce to scythe through populations across the known world by the mid-14th century. When the final toll was counted, perhaps 1/3 of Europe lay still and cold, with similar devastation visited upon the lands of Asia. A second fault line emerged in the growing divide between the empires, nomadic roots and its increasingly settled reality. The Mongol thunderbolt that had shattered the old world order was forged in the harsh crucible of steppe life in men who could ride before they could walk, and shoot a bow from horseback with deadly precision. As imperial princes exchanged felt tents for marble palaces and mare's milk for fine wines, the martial edge that had carved out their domain gradually dulled. Those born to silk sheets rather than saddles could not recapture the fierce resilience that had propelled their grandfathers to conquer half the known world. Religious tensions smoldered beneath the veneer of imperial tolerance. In the Ilkhanate, the wound of Baghdad's fall in 1258, when Hulag's armies put the ancient seat of Islamic learning to the sword and drowned the last Abbasid caliph in the Tigris, festered in the hearts of the faithful. Though later, Ilkhans embraced Islam, beginning with Genghis Khan's conversion in 1295, some scars proved too deep for time to heal. Similar resentments took root in China, where the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan elevated foreign administrators above native Chinese scholars, planting dragon's teeth that would eventually spring up as armed rebellion. The vast tapestry of the empire stretched across too many lands, and peoples began to tear along its seams. Genghis Khan's death in 1259 triggered the first Great Ripa, bitter succession struggle between his brothers Kublai and Arik Beykai that effectively divided the realm. Though Kublai claimed victory, the unity of purpose that had animated the empire's expansion never fully recovered. By the century's end, the four great khanates functioned as sovereign powers, connected by bloodlines and cultural heritage, but pursuing independent paths through history. Yet even as the political architecture crumbled, the bridges of commerce and culture it had supported remained standing. Central authority faded like a slow sunset rather than a sudden eclipse. Caravans still traced the ancient roots. Scholars still exchanged ideas across linguistic divides, and administrative innovations outlived the empire that had birthed them. The echo of this golden age would reverberate through centuries to come. The dream of Eurasian unity, first realized under Mongol dominion, would haunt the ambitions of later conquerors, from Timur to the Russian czars. The commercial networks established during this era laid the groundwork for the first truly global economy. Most profoundly, the unprecedented mingling of ideas, technologies, and worldviews forever altered humanity's trajectory, breaking down the walls between isolated knowledge systems and creating fertile ground for the scientific and commercial revolutions that would transform the world in ways even the great Genghis Khan could never have imagined. As your eyelids grow heavy, let your mind wander to the ancient Silk Road. You are a weary traveler, your caravan's Bactrian camels swaying rhythmically beneath treasures of lustrous silk, fragrant spices, and delicate porcelain. The wind whispers secrets across the vast Central Asian steppes as you journey onward. Ahead lies Samarkand, with its azure domes piercing the Skaya crossroads where worlds collide. In its sprawling bazaars, a Persian merchant haggles with a Chinese trader in animated gestures, while nearby an Indian spice seller exchanges knowing glances with a European buyer. A dozen languages dance in the air like music. Meanwhile, in distant Baghdad, scholars huddle by lamplight, their fingers tracing astronomical calculations from Chinese scrolls, while comparing them to Greek medical wisdom, their minds birthing new knowledge from this unprecedented fusion of ideas. This tapestry of humanity where brutality and enlightenment were woven together in equal measure created a singular moment when the walls between isolated civilizations crumbled. The vastness of the Mongol domains made perfect political unity an impossible dream to maintain across such cultural diversity. Yet the vision of a connected Eurasia, first glimpsed during this golden age, would echo through history, inspiring dreamers and conquerors for generations to come. Yet paradise always carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. The warrior spirit that forged this empire began to soften as royal children grew up amid palace luxuries. Instead of the harsh discipline of nomadic life, these princes, who had never felt the bite of steppe winters or the hunger that drove their ancestors, lacked the iron resolve of their forebears. Succession became a bloody affair, brother turning against brother with increasing frequency and ferocity throughout the conquered lands. Subjugated peoples who had bent the knee now straightened their backs, watching for weakness in their once invincible overlords. Yet even in dissolution, this empire reshaped Eurasia's destiny and left footprints that would never be erased from human memory. For such is the fate of all empires, however vast their domains, however mighty their armies, however brilliant their achievements, to rise like the morning sun, to shine with blinding glory at their zenith, and then to slowly descend below the horizon, leaving only the afterglow of their legacy to illuminate the pages of history. As sleep finally embraces you, imagine standing at the ruins of Karakorum, once the proud capital of the world's greatest empire, now returned to the eternal grasslands from which it rose. The whisper of the wind through the tall grass seems to carry echoes of thundering hooves and the distant voices of those who once ruled half the known world. In this peaceful moment between wakefulness and dreams, you understand that empires may fade, but their stories endure, carried forward through time on the invisible currents of human memory and imagination. Part 6: The Twilight of an Empire. How the Mongol Colossus crumbled like all great empires before it. The realm forged by Genghis Khan contained within its vastness the seeds of its own undoing. As your eyelids grow heavy, journey with me through the gradual unraveling of history's largest contiguous land empire. Watch as this magnificent tapestry of conquest frays at its edges, transforming from a unified global force into a mosaic of kingdoms, each following its own star. The first threads began to loosen, even as the empire reached its zenith. When Genghis Khan drew his final breath in 1259 during the campaign against the southern Song in China, he left behind a dangerous vacuum. With no clear succession mechanism established, his brothers Kublai and Arik Beka both reached for the throne, plunging the empire into its first true civil war. Though Kublai emerged victorious by 1264, the unified vision that had propelled the Mongols across Eurasia lay fractured, never to be fully restored. Kublai's fateful decision following his victory spoke volumes about the empire's changing nature. Abandoning Karakoram, the heartland capital, where the endless wind still carried whispers of Genghis Khan's voice, he established his court at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and proclaimed the Yuan dynasty in China. While this pragmatic choice placed him at the center of the empire's wealthiest territories, it severed crucial spiritual ties to the ancestral steppes. Traditional nobles viewed this move with mounting alarm, seeing in Kublai's silken robes and Chinese advisors a betrayal of the hardy nomadic spirit that had forged their power. Many refused to bend the knee, considering him more Chinese emperor than true Khan of the Mongols. This profound philosophical rift between those clinging to the old ways of felt tents and horseback and those embracing the sophisticated governance of conquered civilizations would ultimately tear the empire asunder. What had once been a singular, thundering force gradually crystallized into 4 distinct khanates, each following increasingly divergent paths through history's labyrinth. In China, Kublai's Yuan dynasty represented the most dramatic reinvention of Mongol rule. Presiding over the world's most ancient and complex civilization, Kublai crafted a sophisticated yet precarious balancing act. While adopting the trappings of Chinese imperial tradition, he and his successors maintained their identity as conquerors, creating an elaborate 4-tiered social hierarchy. Mongols at the pinnacle, followed by various Central Asian peoples, then Northern Chinese, with Southern Chinese relegated to the lowest tier. This system, though initially stabilizing, planted deep resentments that would eventually blossom into open rebellion. Yet, amid these tensions, the Yuan period witnessed a remarkable cultural flowering. Theater and literature flourished in unprecedented ways, producing masterpieces like The Romance of the Western Chamber that still captivate audiences today. Science and mathematics leaped forward under scholars like Guo Shujing, whose astronomical observations led to calendar reforms of astonishing precision, and whose hydraulic engineering transformed irrigation across the realm. Perhaps most famously, the brilliant blue and white porcelain that would eventually become synonymous with China emerged during this era. Its delicate surfaces, often adorned with motifs from across the vast empire, visual testimony to the unprecedented cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule. But beneath this cultural efflorescence, the Yuan administration struggled against mounting challenges. Nature itself seemed to turn against them when catastrophic flooding along the Yellow River in the 1340s devastated the northern heartlands. Meanwhile, the paper currency that had initially demonstrated the sophistication of Mongol governance spiraled into ruinous inflation, as successive Khans printed money with reckless abandon to cover mounting deficits. By the mid-14th century, these pressures erupted into widespread unrest, with movements like the Red Turbans, a millenarian Buddhist sect, promising deliverance from foreign rule, raising the standard of rebellion across the countryside. Far to the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia and Mesopotamia traced a distinctly different arc, founded in blood and fire by Hulagu Khan after his devastating campaigns against the Islamic world. This realm gradually melded into the civilization it had conquered. The watershed moment arrived when Ghazan Khan embraced Islam in 1295, not merely as political expediency, but with genuine religious fervor. This conversion accelerated a profound cultural assimilation under Ghazan and his successors, particularly the enlightened Guljetu and Abu Said. Persian administrative traditions were restored, and a remarkable cultural renaissance took root in the very soil that had been soaked with the blood of scholars when Baghdad fell. This period of renewal gave birth to architectural marvels that still inspire a none more impressive than the magnificent Sultaniya Dome, whose turquoise dome seems to capture a piece of the eternal sky that had once inspired Genghis Khan himself. Persian historical writing reached unprecedented heights under the patronage of visionary administrators like Rashid al-Din. His monumental universal history represented something entirely new in human intellectual achievement, the first truly global historical chronicle, weaving together accounts from Europe, China, India, and the Islamic world, a literary monument that could only have been conceived in an era of unprecedented information exchange across formerly impermeable cultural boundaries. Yet, for all its cultural brilliance, the Ilkhanate could not escape the curse of succession that plagued all branches of the imperial family. When Abu Said died childless in 1335, the realm rapidly disintegrated into competing regional dynasties. Though direct rule by Genghis Khan's bloodline had ended, local rulers would continue to invoke connection to the imperial lineage for generations, understanding that even the memory of the world conqueror carried powerful legitimacy in the minds of their subjects. The Golden Horde, controlling the western steppe and Russia, preserved its nomadic character more successfully than its sister khanates. Perhaps this was inevitable, as its territories encompassed the vast rolling grasslands so perfectly suited to the traditional pastoral lifestyle that had forged Mongol identity. From their imposing capital at Sarai on the lower Volga city, whose splendor astonished European visitors, the Khans ruled over a remarkably diverse domain encompassing Russian principalities, Finnic peoples, and numerous Turkic tribes. Under the leadership of Berk Khan 1257-1266, the Golden Horde made a momentous religious choice by embracing Islam, aligning themselves culturally with the Muslim world rather than with the Buddhist and shamanistic traditions increasingly dominant in the empire's eastern realms. This spiritual reorientation carved yet another fault line through the fragmenting imperial sphere. Meanwhile, the Golden Horde's unique relationship with its Russian subjects established governance patterns that would echo through Russian history for centuries thereafter. Russian princes were required to journey to Sarai to receive the Khan's formal authorization, the Yarlik, before assuming power in their territories. This practice reinforced centralized authority even as it sowed the seeds of future resistance. Perhaps most consequential was the preferential treatment granted to the previously obscure princes of Moscow, particularly their authorization to collect tribute on behalf of the Khans throughout the Russian lands. This privilege, intended merely as administrative convenience, inadvertently nourished what would eventually grow into the dominant Russian stata, historical irony of the highest order, the Chagatai Khanate, named for Genghis Khan's second son, became the stage for perhaps the most fascinating cultural drama within the crumbling empire. By the early 14th century, this realm had cleaved into two starkly different worlds. The Western territories embraced Islam and urban life, while Mogulistan in the east clung fiercely to the old waste-felt tents beneath endless skies, the thunder of hooves across windswept grasslands, and resistance to the spreading influence of Islam. This dramatic split illuminated the fundamental tension at the heart of the imperial legacy, the ancient pool of nomadic freedom, against the gravitational force of settled civilization. Geography itself seemed to dictate destiny where vast steppes stretched to the horizon. Nomadic traditions flourished, where rivers nurtured farmland and cities. New forms of governance inevitably took root. Like a slow-moving avalanche, several unstoppable forces accelerated the empire's unraveling. Nature itself seemed to turn against the great Mongol experiment when the climate began to cool, in what historians would later call the Little Ice Age. This subtle shift had profound consequences on the steppes, the vital grasslands that had nourished the massive horse herds underlying Mongol military might began to wither. As winters grew harsher and summers drier, the once inexhaustible cavalry, the beating heart of imperial power, gradually diminished. The ecological foundation of conquest itself was crumbling beneath their feet. Then came the plague-dark irony of imperial success. The unprecedented interconnectedness of the Pax Mongolica trade routes spanning continents, diplomatic exchanges between formerly isolated realms, had created a vast highway for disease, the Black Death, emerging from the very heartlands of Central Asia, raced along these commercial arteries in the 1340s with devastating efficiency. In its wake, it left between 1/3 and half of Eurasia's population dead or dying, beyond the immeasurable human suffering. This demographic catastrophe shattered economic systems from China to the Mediterranean, further weakening the already strained sinews of imperial authority. Meanwhile, the conquerors themselves were changing. The fierce warriors who had swept across continents gradually transformed into administrators, courtiers, and bureaucrats. Children who might once have learned to ride before they could walk now grew up in the sheltered confines of palaces, their hands more accustomed to holding writing brushes than composite bows. The legendary skills that had made their ancestors seemingly invincible, horsemanship that made rider and mount appear as one being, archery so precise it seemed supernatural, faded with each passing generation. As the Mongols softened, their adversaries hardened, studying and adopting the very military innovations that had once overwhelmed them. This military decline manifested in a series of humiliating failures. When the Yuan dynasty launched ambitious naval expeditions against Japan in 1274 and again in 1281, both fleets met catastrophic ends as massive typhoons, the kamikaze or divine winds that would later inspire Japanese martial mythologies, swept them into the depths. Similar disasters befell campaigns in the unfamiliar jungles of Vietnam and the island fortress of Java, where local resistance proved unexpectedly fierce. Each defeat chipped away at the mystique of Mongol invincibility that had once opened city gates before armies even arrived. Perhaps the most profound factor in the empire's dissolution lay in the spiritual and philosophical realm. Genghis Khan's original vision had been a masterpiece of balance, preserving the core virtues of steppe life, while pragmatically adopting useful elements from conquered civilizations. He had created a meritocratic system that rewarded loyalty and competence, regardless of origin. But as the generations passed, this delicate equilibrium collapsed into two opposing extremes. Some factions retreated into rigid traditionalism, rejecting all outside influences as corruption, while others abandoned their heritage entirely, disappearing into the cultures they had conquered. The flexible synthesis that had made the initial expansion so remarkably successful gave way to paralysis or dissolution. The Yuan dynasty in China became the perfect crucible for these contradictions. Kublai Khan, attempting to rule the world's most sophisticated civilization, created an intricate administrative system that blended Chinese bureaucratic traditions with a diverse leadership drawn from across his vast domains. Yet this innovative approach pleased no one. Traditional Mongol nobles viewed it as betrayal of their ancestral ways, while Chinese elites chafed under their systematic exclusion from the highest levels of power. By the 1340s, these simmering tensions, combined with catastrophic flooding, currency collapse, and finally the apocalyptic mortality of the Black Death, created the perfect storm for rebellion. From this chaos emerged an unlikely figure of destiny, Yuan Zhang, born to destitute peasants, who had lost his entire family to famine and plague before finding refuge in a Buddhist monastery. When the Red Turban Rebellion erupted, promising deliverance from foreign rule, Zhu joined their ranks and revealed an extraordinary talent for leadership and strategy. Gradually consolidating rebel forces under his banner, he marched inexorably toward the Yuan capital. In 1368, the last Yuan emperor abandoned his palace and fled northward to the ancestral steppes, ending nearly a century of Mongol rule over China and ushering in the Ming dynasty that would govern the Middle Kingdom for the next 3 centuries. Yet this dramatic retreat did not extinguish the imperial flame in East Asia. The Yuan rulers re-established themselves in Mongolia as the Northern Yuan dynasty, maintaining their claims to the Dragon Throne for generations and occasionally launching ambitious campaigns to recapture their lost territories across the vast expanse of Eurasia. Their cousins in the Western Khanates continued to rule significant territories from Central Asia to Russia and the Middle East, though the connections between these scattered realms grew increasingly tenuous with each passing year. What makes the imperial decline so fascinating is its remarkable unevenness. While political unity shattered relatively quickly, the commercial networks, cultural exchanges, and technological diffusion established during the Pax Mongolica displayed astonishing resilience. Long after central authority had faded, caravans still traced the ancient Silk Road routes. Philosophical and scientific ideas continued to cross formerly impermeable cultural boundaries, and the tantalizing vision of Eurasian unity remained a powerful inspiration that would captivate later conquerors from Timur to the Russian czars. Even as direct rule by Genghis Khan's bloodline receded like an ebbing tide, their legacy remained etched into the very fabric of Eurasian society. Linguistic patterns shifted dramatically as Turkic languages spread across vast territories, often displacing Indo-European tongues that had dominated Central Asia for millennia. cultural practices transformed through unprecedented cross-fertilization, visible in everything from culinary traditions to architectural styles, clothing fashions to musical forms. Modern genetic studies have revealed the profound demographic impact of this era. As population movements reshuffled the human composition of entire regions, leaving markers still detectable in the DNA of millions of people living today. The disintegration of Genghis Khan's empire unfolded like a tapestry being slowly unwoven, each thread following its own distinct path. In Russia, the once mighty Golden Horde's grip loosened gradually, with a pivotal moment coming at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. There, amid the clash of steel and thunder of hooves, Moscow's Prince Dmitri achieved what had once seemed impossible victory against the fearsome horde forces led by Mamai. Though Toktamish would briefly restore Mongol authority with fire and sword, the psychological barrier had been broken. Russian princes had tasted resistance and found it possible. Meanwhile, the Middle Eastern lands, once ruled by the Ilkhanate, became fertile ground for new ambitions. From this power vacuum arose the meteoric Timurate Tamerlane, a brilliant and ruthless Turco-Mongol warlord who claimed connection to the imperial bloodline through marriage. With terrifying efficiency, Timur carved out an empire that briefly rekindled memories of the original Mongol conquest. Cities trembled at his approach, Delhi's streets ran with blood, Damascus surrendered in terror, and ancient Baghdad endured devastation that echoed for generations. Yet for all his military genius, Timur could not solve the fundamental challenge of succession. Upon his death in 1405, his realm splintered among quarreling heirs, a stark reminder that Genghis Khan's true legacy lay not just in conquest, but in the remarkable administrative vision that had held such vast territories together. In the heartlands of Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate dissolved into a constellation of competing Turco-Mongol states, each preserving fragments of the imperial tradition while adapting to local conditions. The most dramatic transformation would come when one branch of these descendants, led by the charismatic Babur, journeyed southward into the Indian subcontinent. There, in 1526, they established the magnificent Mughal Empire, a name that itself echoed across centuries, preserving in its very syllables the memory of their Mongol ancestry, even as they embraced Persian culture and Indian traditions. Perhaps most surprisingly, even in East Asia, where the Yuan retreat from China appeared most complete, imperial influence continued to flow like an underground river. The Ming dynasty that supplanted Mongol rule found itself adopting numerous innovations from the very regime it had overthrown, from the sophisticated postal relay system that connected distant provinces to the economic revolution of paper currency. The shadow dance between the Ming and the northern Yuan continued for generations, with raids and diplomatic exchanges shaping military strategies and border policies on both sides. By the early 15th century, though Genghis Khan's political creation had fractured into regional successor states with increasingly distant connections, to his original vision, the world these states inhabited bore the indelible imprint of that brief, extraordinary moment of continental unity. The memory of a single authority stretching from the Pacific shores to the Hungarian plains would haunt the imagination of rulers and peoples for centuries to come, a ghost of possibility that could never quite be exorcised. As your consciousness drifts toward the velvet embrace of deeper sleep, envision the last descendants of those world conquerors still roaming the windswept grasslands of Mongolia. See them gazing upward at the eternal blue sky Tengri that had inspired their legendary ancestor, Their political dominion had faded like morning mist, yet the echoes of their ancestors' hoofbeats still resonated across continents, detectable in the trading networks that linked distant cities, in diplomatic protocols that preserved steppe traditions, in the movement of peoples whose very languages and genetics had been reshaped by imperial policies, and in the cross-pollination of ideas that had flourished under the brief flowering of the Pax Mongolica. The dissolution of history's largest contiguous land empire reveals itself not as simple collapse, but as metamorphosis, complex transformation, where imperial structures gradually yielded to new political formations that nevertheless carried forward essential elements of that remarkable synthesis first forged in the crucible of conquest. Even as direct rule by Genghis Khan's descendants receded, the tantalizing vision of Eurasian unity they had briefly realized would continue to seduce later empire builders, from the expansionist Russian czars to the ambitious Mughal emperors of India. Like a dream half-remembered upon waking, the idea of a unified Eurasia would haunt historical imagination long after its physical manifestation had vanished. Part 7. The Last Days of the Mongols. How the greatest empire faded into history as twilight falls on our historical journey. We enter the final chapter of the once mighty Mongol realm. Like a great river flowing into countless tributaries, the empire dissolved not in sudden cataclysm, but through centuries of gradual transformation. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep's embrace, join me in tracing how this extraordinary historical tapestry slowly unwound, leaving threads that continue to weave through our world today. Each successor state carved its own unique path through history, shaped by geography, local dynamics, and emerging powers. In the Eastern Territories, the Northern Yuan dynasty, established by the royal family after their Chinese expulsion, maintained the purest connection to their ancestral homeland, retreating to the windswept Mongolian plateau. Kublai Khan's descendants preserved their nomadic traditions while harboring dreams of reclaiming China's dragon throne. These ambitions weren't mere fantasy. Under Togan Timur, the last Yuan emperor to rule China and his successors, the Northern Yuan maintained formidable military might, launching persistent raids into Ming territory. For generations, the Ming dynasty poured vast resources into defensive campaigns against this relentless threat, constructing elaborate fortifications that would eventually evolve into sections of the Great Wall that mesmerize tourists today. The Northern Yuan's power shattered in 1388 when Ming forces under General Lan Yu delivered a crushing blow at the Battle of Beer Lake. This devastating defeat decimated the imperial nobility and scattered survivors across the steppe. Though the Northern Yuan persisted in name until the 1600s, they never again threatened China's heartland. Increasingly confined to their ancestral territories and steadily losing ground to the Concedent Oirat Confederation from Western Mongolia. The empire's slow dissolution accelerated when Altan Khan's powerful Mongol leader embraced Tibetan Buddhism in the late 16th century, establishing close ties with the Gelug school. He bestowed the title of Dalai Lama upon its spiritual head, a title that endures to this day. This spiritual transformation fundamentally altered steppe culture, as gilded monasteries replaced felt tents as centers of power. Warriors who once thundered across continents now donned monks' robes, and the martial traditions that fueled the original conquests withered as Buddhist principles of compassion supplanted the fierce warrior ethos. By the 17th century, Mongolia had fractured into a patchwork of competing khanates. This disunity left them vulnerable when a new nomadic power the Manchuros to prominence along their eastern borders. In 1636, the southern Mongols submitted to Manchu authority, and by 1691, most of Inner Mongolia had been absorbed into the expanding Qing dynasty. Outer Mongolia maintained its independence until 1755, when it too fell under Qing control, effectively severing the last direct political connection to Genghis Khan's legacy in his homeland, in the vast heartlands of Central Asia. The Chagatai Khanate followed an equally complex trajectory of fragmentation and reinvention. By the mid-14th century, it had already split between Western territories, increasingly embracing Islamic culture, and Eastern Mongolistan, which maintained stronger ties to traditional steppe practices. This division deepened over generations as divergent cultural and political forces reshaped each region. The Western Chagatai territories transformed into the magnificent Timurid Empire, following the conquests of Timur Tamerlane in the late 14th century, though claiming imperial connection through marriage rather than direct descent. Timur deliberately modeled his rule on Mongol precedents, blending steppe military tactics with Islamic governance. His capital at Samarkand, where breathtaking azure-domed buildings still stand today, showcases this cultural fusion, with architectural elements drawn from Persia to India, a physical manifestation of the cultural crossroads the Mongol conquests had created. After Timur's death in 1405, his empire splintered among rival heirs. One branch of his descendants, led by the charismatic Babur, would eventually establish the glorious Mughal Empire in India in 1526, preserving elements of steppe tradition within an increasingly Persian and later Indian cultural framework. Even the name Mughal echoes Mongol, preserving linguistic memory of origins, while cultural connections grew increasingly distant, like a fading dream still remembered upon waking. Eastern Chagatai territories followed a different path, gradually absorbed into the expanding Jungar Khanate, a powerful confederation of Western Mongol tribes that briefly revived the nomadic imperial tradition in the 17th and early 18th centuries. At its zenith, the Jungar state controlled vast territories from the towering Altai Mountains to the steppes of eastern Kazakhstan, before being utterly annihilated by Qing expansion in the 1750s. The Ilkhanate in Persia had already collapsed by the mid-14th century, dissolving into competing regional dynasties as plague, economic upheaval, and succession disputes undermined central authority. Yet even as political structures crumbled, cultural synthesis flourished. The Jalarid and Timurid dynasties that emerged from this dissolution nurtured and developed the remarkable artistic and intellectual traditions that had blossomed during imperial rule. Persian painting reached unprecedented heights, seamlessly blending Chinese-influenced landscape techniques with Islamic artistic traditions. Historical writing flourished, preserving crucial records of the imperial era, while Persian administrative systems themselves, partly reformed during Ilkhanid rules, spread to neighboring regions, influencing governance from Anatolia to the Indian subcontinent. By the 16th century, the rise of the Safavid dynasty established a new Persian order centered on Shia Islam, largely erasing the political legacy of steppe rule, while absorbing many of its cultural and administrative innovations, like a river that changes course but carries the same waters. Further west, the Ottoman Empire similarly incorporated elements of steppe military tactics and administrative practices into a state increasingly anchored in Islamic and Byzantine traditions. Perhaps the most dramatic transformation unfolded in the territories of the Golden Horde across Russia and the western steppes. From the late 14th century, this once mighty khanate splintered into competing hordes. The Great Horde controlling the Volga heartlands, the Crimean Khanate along the Black Sea, the Kazakh Khanate in the eastern steppes, the Astrakhan Khanate at the Volga's mouth, and the Sibir Khanate in western Siberia. This fragmentation coincided with the rising power of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which had initially flourished as a privileged tribute collector for the Khans. Under ambitious leaders like Ivan III, Moscow gradually asserted independence, refusing tribute payments and steadily expanding its territory. The symbolic moment of liberation came in 1480 when Grand Prince Ivan III openly defied Khanate of the Great Horde, effectively ending Moscow's submission to steppe authority and beginning Russia's emergence as a major power. Over subsequent centuries, the ascendant Russian state methodically absorbed the former Golden Horde territories. In 1552, Ivan IV the Terrible conquered the Khanate of Kazan, and in 1556, the Khanate of Astrakhan fell to his armies. These pivotal conquests gave Russia control of the entire Volga River, the great artery of Eastern European trade, effectively isolating the remaining steppe powers from one another. The Sibir Khanate succumbed to Cossack adventurers in the 1580s, opening the vast Siberian frontier to Russian colonization. The Crimean Khanate maintained independence longer by accepting Ottoman protection, remaining powerful enough to launch devastating raids into Russian territory as late as 1571, when they reduced Moscow to ashes. Yet even this resilient successor state eventually fell, annexed by Catherine the Great's expanding Russian Empire in 1783. The last politically significant remnant, the Kazakh Khanate, preserved independence until the 18th century, when Russian expansion gradually eroded their territory and autonomy. By the 1820s, the remaining Kazakh lands had been incorporated into the Russian Empire, marking the final disappearance of independent political entities descended from Genghis Khan's original imperial structure. The process by which these successor states were absorbed into expanding agricultural empires reveals a profound historical irony. The unprecedented success of the Mongol conquests had inadvertently created conditions for the ultimate triumph of the sedentary civilizations they had once dominated. The Pax Mongolica had facilitated technological diffusion that gradually eroded the military advantages of steppe warriors. Gunpowder weapons, introduced to Europe partly through the connected trading world the Mongols created, eventually neutralized the decisive advantage of the composite bow that had helped conquer half the known world. The brilliant organizational techniques pioneered by Mongol armies were studied and adapted by their former subjects, creating military systems that could match steppe mobility while fielding vastly larger forces. Climate change further undermined traditional steppe advantages. The Little Ice Age that descended upon Eurasia in the late medieval period reduced the productivity of the grasslands, limiting the size of horse herds and consequently diminishing the military potential of nomadic societies. The conversion of many steppe peoples to universalizing religions Islam in the West, Buddhism in the East gradually replaced the spiritual framework that had motivated the original conquests, often prioritizing stability and religious devotion over expansion and conquest. Yet even as the political structures established by the imperial conquest faded into history, their legacy endured in profound and often unexpected ways. These echoes resonate through linguistic patterns across Eurasia, reflecting the massive population movements triggered by imperial expansion and collapse. Modern genetic studies reveal the biological footprint of these historical upheavals. Researchers have identified a white chromosomal lineage present in approximately 8% of men across a vast region of Asia, likely connected to the imperial expansion and the reproductive advantages it conferred on the conquering elite. This means that today, an estimated 16 million men may carry genes directly descended from the imperial ruling clan, what scientists have named the Genghis Khan effect. Cultural and institutional legacies proved equally enduring. Russian political development was profoundly shaped by centuries of interaction with steppe powers, influencing everything from governance practices to diplomatic protocols. Chinese administrative systems incorporated numerous innovations from the Yuan period, and across the vast expanses of Central Asia, social structures still partly reflect the tribal reorganizations implemented under imperial rule. The tapestry of our modern world remains interwoven with threads from this bygone era. Look at any map of Central Asia's national boundaries, still echo the ancient divisions of imperial provinces and successor khanates. Gaze across the vast expanse of Eurasia, and you'll see ethnic and linguistic patterns shaped by the great migrations of this period. And in the heart of the steppes, today's Mongolia, though merely a shadow of the once mighty empired cradles, the cultural essence of Genghis Khan's homeland, preserving it like a precious heirloom passed through generations. But perhaps nothing endures more powerfully than memory itself. For Mongolians, the imperial age shines as their defining moment on the world stage, a wellspring of national pride flowing through every aspect of contemporary life. Walk through Ulaanbaatar, and you'll find Genghis Khan's legacy everywhere. His name graces everything from the international airport to bottles of premium vodka. His stern visage, watching over the nation he set on history's grandest stage, beyond Mongolia's borders. This historical memory transforms into something more complex, kaleidoscope of competing narratives. Russians have wrestled for centuries with their relationship to the Golden Horde, alternately viewing it as a crushing yoke that stunted their development, or as the formative crucible that forged Russian uniqueness. Chinese historians have swung between portraying the Yuan dynasty as barbaric oppressors or legitimate emperors who contributed vital chapters to China's long imperial saga. Central Asian nations navigate equally nuanced historical waters. Even their names tell stories. Kazakhstan itself preserves the memory of the Kipchak peoples who formed the backbone of the Golden Horde. Yet these modern crafting narratives that honor both the destruction and the remarkable synthesis that emerged from the ashes. As dawn's first gentle rays touch our narrative journey, pause to consider the extraordinary path we've traveled together, from the birth of a humble chieftain's son on the windswept Mongolian plateau to the rise of history's largest contiguous land empire, through its gradual metamorphosis and eventual disappearance. Few historical forces have so profoundly redirected humanity's course or left such varied and enduring imprints across such vast stretches of our world. This empire didn't collapse in dramatic cataclysm, but dissolved gradually through adaptation. The conquerors themselves were eventually conquered. The rulers ultimately ruled. Yet through this process, they permanently altered every society they touched, leaving indelible marks on the parchment of human history. As sleep begins to envelop you, return once more to those endless horizons of the Mongolian steppes where this remarkable saga began. Envision the felt-covered gears silhouetted against the vast azure sky. Horses grazing peacefully on the rippling ocean of grass, these simple origins of a force that would reshape continents. Contemplate how such humble beginnings birthed an empire that, though politically extinct for centuries, continues to influence our world in countless subtle ways. From the genetic legacy carried in our blood to the borders etched on our maps, from the languages that form our thoughts to the historical memories that shape our identities. Khan has vanished like morning mist from the steppe, yet the world it helped create, connected, transformed, and forever altered by this extraordinary historical phenomenon remains our collective inheritance. As you finally surrender to slumber's embrace, carry with you the echoing hoofbeats across the centuries, the rise and fall of humanity's greatest land empire, and the enduring legacy of the man who started it all, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler whose vision momentarily united the Eurasian world and permanently redirected the river of human history. And with that, dear listener, our journey through the epic of Genghis Khan comes to its end. I hope these tales of conquest, innovation, and transformation have carried you gently into the realm of dreams. Thank you for traveling across centuries and continents with me, from the vast Mongolian steppes to the far reaches of an empire that changed our world forever, until our paths cross again in another historical adventure. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams as boundless as the eternal blue sky that watched over the greatest land empire the world has ever known. Good night.